Joanna Richardson, who's from the University of Edinburgh, a PhD student. She's researching the portrayal of the Scottish invasion of Ireland in John Barber's The Bruce. Her historical interests are eclectic, but focus broadly on the development of cultural and identity in the British Isles and the ways in which works of literature can be used to aid historical study of these ideas. Her talk today is titled The Knight as Ruler, exploring the interaction and conflicts between kingship and chivalry in John Barber's The Bruce. So you can go ahead, Joanna.
Thank you very much, Tessa. I'm going to keep my camera off, one, because you can't really see it anyway, and secondly, because my internet will thank me for it. So we will jump straight in. So first, for those of you, if my slide will click on, there we go. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Bruce as a text, or even with Scottish medieval history from the 14th century, I'm just going to give you some brief context to help you hopefully understand some of the quotes when I get into in a minute. So the Bruce is one of the most extensive accounts of the Scottish Wars of Independence and the reign of Robert I of Scotland. It was written in around 1375 by John Barber, who was the Archdeacon of Aberdeen at the time, and most likely as a commission from Robert II, who was the king at the end of the 14th century. And historians generally think this because there was a pension granted to Barber in 1378, which states that it is, as a quote on the slide says, for the compilation of the book of the deeds of the late King Robert the Bruce. So whilst that doesn't specifically say that, we kind of take that to mean this text we're talking about today. And Barber combines aspects of romance, epic, and historical literature to create a text that is both engaging for his audience and, amongst other aims, lends historical legitimacy to Robert II and the Bruce dynasty more generally. And this mixture of influences continues to cause debate about how best to define the Bruce in terms of genre and how the different elements of the text should be read and approached. And whilst we won't dive into that complex debate here because we do not have the time or even the inclination, I think it's important to have these various influences in the back of our minds when we're looking at the examples from this paper and just be a bit aware of them. So the narrative of the Bruce is largely based around the figures that you see on the screen now. That is Robert Bruce and James Douglas, who are both worthy and highly capable knights who fight on behalf of Scotland against English incursion. And as the slide also says, Robert Bruce is the King of Scotland as well. And in addition, a fair amount of attention is given to Edward Bruce, brother to Robert, who is almost equal to Robert and Douglas in worthiness, and is shown to play a prominent role in the Scottish Wars of Independence. Also, although Barber does emphasise the almost equal to Robert and Douglas quite a lot. Given this cast of kings and knights, it is unsurprising that Barber is concerned with both chivalry and kingship. And I've added Edward I on there. We're not really going to talk about him today, but it seemed a bit rude to leave him off because he's quite a major character in the story. So just so you know, he's there too. So given these characters, the importance of both chivalry and kingship to the portrayal of Robert Bruce and his brother Edward Bruce make this text a useful one for exploring how these two aspects of identity interacted with each other. And this is especially true because Edward Bruce is shown to be a more complex character who undergoes a notable change within the narrative. Whilst being lauded for his hardiment, meaning great courage, in fighting for the Scottish cause alongside his brother, when Edward takes up leadership of the Scottish campaigns in Ireland in 1315, he begins to draw more criticism, both explicitly and implicitly in the text. And one of the main differences between these sections of the text is that Edward has moved from being purely a knight to both a knight and a king after being crowned King of Ireland in 1315. And this begs the question, how important is Edward's position as both a king and a knight to the change that we see in his depiction and his eventual demise, which, spoilers, also happens in the text as well. Sorry, skipping on to my next slide here. Medieval chivalry and kingship are both topics that have received a considerable amount of academic attention and debate, and it is also true that these concepts were equally debated within the medieval period itself. It has been increasingly noted by historians that the idea of what made a good king or a good knight was complex and that there were often contradictions within the body of medieval writing on these subjects. Richard Caper and Christopher Taylor have both highlighted the very difficult nature of neatly pinning down the standard for chivalry in particular, and Laura Ashe has added to this by arguing, as the quote on the slide says, that chivalry is conceived as a standard that differs over time and within different contexts deliberately, because its predominant aim is the art of success, which Ashe defines as social, aristocratic, martial, and political success. And within the broader debate on chivalry, those who have studied the Bruce in particular have emphasised Barber's deliberately pragmatic approach to the concept. Indeed, the historical reality of the Scottish Wars of Independence, as many historians have pointed out, demanded a degree of pragmatism due to the very nature of the conflict, and it's known to be one that's relatively bloody, in which quite a lot of the normal rules of combat have been suspended. And Callum Watson, Anne McKinn, Sonia Cameron, and Bernice Kilman, just to name a few, have all proposed that Barber goes as far as deliberately presenting a new and more pragmatic form of chivalry, specifically for the 14th century context. That's one of the aims of his text. Less explicit attention has been given to Barber's portrayal of kingship in current research, but without going into too much detail here, I will make some broad observations by comparing the kings in the Bruce to Mero's for Princes literature, which was the genre in the medieval period used to instruct and critique the performance of kings. The most important underlying concept for Mero's for Princes, at least in my view, was that a king should avoid any self-centered action and put off any emotion or practice that might encourage him to act on his own behalf and interest rather than that of his people. And the idea is also very relevant to Barber, as his portrayal of the Scottish Wars of Independence was almost certainly influenced by documents such as the Declaration of Arbroath. Sorry, and for those of you who don't know, the Declaration of Arbroath was written to the Pope by Scottish magnates in 1320 to justify their appointment of Robert Bruce as their king. And central to the argument in this document is the idea that the community of Scotland has the power to appoint their own king and the ability to change that king if he does not protect their rights and interests. Aside from just being very interesting concepts and ideas, these ideas not only focus attention on the personal qualities of the Scottish king specifically, but also imply that the king is bound by certain responsibilities towards his subjects. The interaction between chivalry and kingship has not always been considered in any great depth by studies of both these conflicts individually. As historians have increasingly highlighted the complexities within medieval standards of chivalry and kingship and explored how these values were implemented in reality, the relationship between these two concepts, however, has seemingly gained more attention, and is quite interesting. As Maurice Keane has argued, kingship and chivalry overlapped a great deal, and by the late medieval period it was actually expected that a king would also be a knight. John Watts agrees with this in his study of Henry IV and argues that, as the quote on your screen says, knights were encouraged to aspire to essentially the same array of political virtues as kings, and for the same reasons. This overlap is also made clear in medieval texts such as Christine de Pizan's Letter of Itheo to Hector, which is written as a mirror for princes literature rather than a text, but is a text predominantly concerned with chivalry, but still refers to Hector throughout as a knight and uses that type of language a lot. This picture, however, remains complicated because the behaviour of knights in many medieval romances, for example, the predominant one that is talked about being the Chanson de Roland, does seem to endorse a self-interested form of chivalry that directly contradicts the value of kingship stated in Mero's for Princes. And Andrew Cowell, in his study of the Chanson de Roland, repeatedly emphasises Roland's decision to avoid retreat despite overwhelming odds as a specific assertion of his own will. And it is this assertion which separates the hero from Charlemagne, who as king remains under a generalised obligation to the society he represents. And that quote is also on the slide for you there. So there's a really obvious distinction being made between the king and the knight. Returning to Barber's text, it would seem that whilst kingship and chivalry are not always in conflict with each other, there are some instances in which tension arises when characters attempt to fulfil their obligations to both standards. And one of So we'll go into a few examples here now. I'll just click my slide on. It takes a while to load. One of the most debated aspects of chivalry is how a knight was expected to integrate within wider society, especially as chivalry also emphasizes individual honor and prowess as of central importance to the whole enterprise. Was the knight fundamentally at odds with the community or in service to it, or even somewhere in between those two? This is also perhaps the most major contention between kingship and knighthood, as mirror to princess literature continually emphasizes that a king must act for the benefit of the community over and above himself. In the works of many medieval writers, acting from self-interest was deemed as the most recognizable sign that a king had become a tyrant. So it's a serious business. And this issue is approached by Barber at the opening of his depiction of the Battle of Dundalk in Ireland, which ultimately leaves the Scots defeated and Edward Bruce killed. After receiving advice from his knights that it would not be wise to engage in the battle because the Scots are greatly outnumbered, Edward answers this criticism by saying, and this is the quote on your side, I will read the English just for ease, but I've also put the Scots up there for you too. Edward replies saying, alas, I never thought to hear that from you. Now let whoever wants to help, but rest assured I will fight today without more delay, and let no man say while I'm alive that superior numbers would make me flee. God forbid that anyone should blame us for defending our holy name. Noble name, sorry. It's very important. It is made very clear by Barber that honour is the motivation behind Edward's actions here. His predominant concern is his reputation as a brave and fierce fighter who is not intimidated by overwhelming numbers. Barber's judgment on this decision and the disastrous defeat that it causes, which we'll look at in a moment, also makes it clear that the reader is meant to see this decision in a critical light. It's not a good look for Edward. Again, we'll read the English here. So this is how the noblemen were lost there, through stubbornness, a sin and a great sorrow. For if their outstanding courage had been led with intelligence and moderation, unless a great misfortune had befallen them, it would have been a very difficult task to lead them to disaster. But a great unbridled pride led them to buy their valour dearly. Barber makes it clear that the price paid to defend the knight's honour was in this case just too high, and the strong language specifically associates Edward and his actions with pride, which is one of the 7 deadly sins, so again, very serious in nature. This not only emphasises the serious nature of this transgression, but also the intrinsically self-centered motivation behind it. It was not unique for contemporaries to criticise knights in this way, however, it must be noted. Christopher Almond, for example, argues that a knight was expected, to a certain extent, to serve the common good, and that war was not to be conducted for the gaining of personal advantage. It is, however, noticeable that Edward Bruce has not been criticised for this kind of behaviour previously, so there is an inconsistency here within the text. Again, this being more severe when he is also performing the identity of king. And another key characteristic of a knight was military prowess, and as a result, knights needed warfare because it was perceived to be the highest arena in which to display their military prowess. A king, by contrast, acting for the benefits of his subjects, was ideally meant to strive towards peace in his kingdom. And again, the tension between these two needs is something that Lee Patterson, drawing on Johann Huizinga's work, sees as central in placing knights in opposition to the rest of society. And whilst many have seen this opposition as a little overemphasized by these scholars, it remains clear that what to do with knights in peacetime was a serious consideration in medieval Europe. And we can also see this potential conflict in the Bruce when Edward Bruce first makes the transition from Scotland to Ireland. Barber opens this passage by stating Edward's purpose in invading Ireland as follows. Again, this is on the slide for you. Sir Edward, Earl of Carrick, who was stronger than a leopard and had no desire to live in peace, felt that Scotland was too small for him and his brother, therefore he formed a purpose that he would become King of Ireland. I should add the bold and the italics is my emphasis in these quotes. And this seemingly restless action, also again firmly motivated by personal gain, comes directly after the Scots' important victory against the English at the Battle of Bannockburn, which comes just before in this text, when Robert Bruce is shown to have brought peace and prosperity to Scotland under his kingship in very idyllic and beautiful language. Edward's energetic reintroduction of war into the narrative creates a noticeable contrast between the two brothers, and it shows Edward somewhat at odds with Robert's aims as a responsible king and arguably the interests of Scotland as a community. This need for action on Edward's behalf is again noted at the opening of Barber's narration of the doomed Battle of Dundalk mentioned earlier. Edward is advised to await reinforcements coming from Scotland. And again, this is the quote on the screen. But instead of waiting, he decides just to go ahead and scout out the area and ends up being involved in the battle. And it's said, he is described by Barber as always irritated by inaction, always wanting to be busy. And again, this shows a need for action, especially warfare, which leads to bad decisions and disastrous consequences, both for Edward and the Scots more generally. And the potential threat that a knight posed to society is something that other medieval authors were also concerned with. Michael Stroud, for example, argues that the knight's potential as a source for harm is present in the works of Thomas Malory, and I'm sure there are many other examples if we had the time to go through them all. Now, it's clear that it was not impossible to be both a king and a knight, and indeed I am in no way suggesting that. It was expected that kings in the late medieval period would also be knights, and Robert Bruce himself is both a king and a knight throughout this whole text, and Barber does not show any tension in his performance of both of these roles. And I believe that what these examples involving Edward Bruce show is the potential for conflict between the more self-interested aspects of chivalry and the broader need for a king to act in the interests of his people. This is indeed an important theme in the Bruce more widely, as the community of Scotland is given great prominence by Barber. And Sergei Maynard adds to this by arguing that the key factor in Barber's version of chivalry that he's proposing that distinguishes between successful leaders and non-successful ones is the ability to be flexible and to balance a whole range of factors based on any one situation. And we might add balance a range of identities into that as well. And this supports the idea mentioned earlier that Barber is interested in a much more pragmatic application of chivalry, but also seeing that Edward's particular brand of chivalric prowess, whilst useful for fighting the wars of independence in Scotland, was not seen by Barber as suitable for the long-term health of the Scottish community. To close, I think Caper's observation in his study of chivalry in the Bruce is helpful here. He observes that, and my slide has not carried on, so I'll do that. He observes that ideals are important, but they could not always be upheld and practiced simultaneously and with equivalence of commitment, which I quite like as a quote. And this does have the potential to sound a little like an excuse for not following an ideal, but it also highlights the practicalities of actually implementing ideological standards in the reality of the medieval world. And these examples from the Bruce also do as much to highlight the internal debates and conflict within concepts like chivalry and kinship as they do the relationship between these identities. And these debates were part of the process through which medieval people conceptualized how both kings and knights fitted into the community and in what ways they needed to be restricted to ensure the health of the community. It is, however, inescapable that part of the transformation of Edward Bruce into a character who is at odds with the narrative and the Scottish community is his attempt to inhabit the overlapping space between kingship and knighthood. And this, at the very least, cautions us from assuming that this task of balancing both these identities came easily or automatically and without risk or complication for those who attempted it. And I realise that the nature of this paper means I've pushed through a lot of secondary literature, but there's a list there for any of you that might want to screen grab that, or if you would like to read that afterwards, please just let me know and I'm happy to send it across to you. But thank you, that's me.